A terrible accident has left the Deadliest catch family grieving a devastating loss. One of their bravest fishermen paid the ultimate price in the dangerous fight against the sea. The crew was caught in a deadly storm, and what started as a routine haul quickly turned into a fight for survival. How could something so routine turn so tragic? Let us uncover what really happened in those terrifying final moments that will make you fear the ocean like never before. With almost 60 pots already pulled and loaded, Jake's crew thought they were heading toward a huge payday. They'd pushed further northwest than ever, gambling for the motherlode of crabs. And it worked. The nets were fuller than anyone dared to dream, easily 200, maybe 300 crabs in a single haul. For a few hours, it was like all their hard work had finally paid off. Then the weather turned, fast. The wind picked up, the rain turned sideways, and what was once a promising day quickly became a life-and-death struggle. They knew they had to hurry up, finish their work, and return home to their families. But it wasn't just the wind. Something else was about to go terribly wrong. Before we go any further, it's clear this accident was far more devastating than anyone could have prepared for, and what came next will leave you completely stunned. Captain Jake's excitement turned to worry as a strange beep echoed from the sonar. It wasn't a sound they were used to, and it got everyone's attention. Jake knew the sea's signals well enough to understand that when something feels wrong, you don't ignore it. He ordered his crew to prepare for the worst. That anchor cable needed to stay tight, or the winch could rip clean off the ship, which would spell disaster. Jake's hands were tied. His main concern now was trying to keep everyone safe. The situation on deck went from bad to worse in no time. The rain was relentless, the waves smashing the boat like a giant's fist. Jake gave orders like a man trying to outshout the storm itself. The most dangerous spot on deck became the winch. If the cable snapped, anyone standing near it would be in serious trouble, and Jake's warnings got more desperate. One of the deckhands almost went overboard when the cable got caught, jerking suddenly. It was the kind of moment that made everyone freeze in terror for a split second. They had all seen enough men go overboard to know that it's often the last anyone sees of them. Then, as if the sea wasn't trouble enough, another ship came creeping dangerously close. It was the Wizard. Captain Jake had seen her many times before, but not like this, not this close, and not in a storm like this. It seemed like a collision was unavoidable. The crews of both ships braced for impact, and you could feel the panic. The waves heaved, and the two vessels barely missed crashing into each other. But while they avoided a direct hit, it was close enough to leave everyone rattled. Jake couldn't deal with the Wizard's captain right then. He had a whole crew relying on him to make the right decisions to get them back to port in one piece. But no matter how experienced a captain you are, there are moments when the ocean just doesn't care. One wrong move, one slip on the wet deck, and tragedy strikes. A crew member lost his footing, and the next thing anyone knew, he was gone. The freezing cold of the Bering Sea swallowed him up in seconds, and the crew could only stare in horror. They'd pulled up a haul bigger than anything they'd seen before, but it didn't matter anymore. In one heart-stopping moment, the reality of their dangerous life came crashing back. Jake and his crew knew they had to keep going, but the mood on the ship had darkened. The high of catching so many crabs meant nothing compared to the low of losing a man. Jake tried to keep them moving, shouting orders, keeping them focused, but everyone knew something had changed. Each wave that hit the ship felt like it was mocking them. When you're at sea, you don't have time to process grief. You have to keep moving, keep working, and hope you make it back to land. But then, just as they tried to wrap up and head back, something else caught Jake's attention. Another strange noise from below. Not the anchor, not the cable, but something else entirely. The sea was playing tricks, and whatever was going on down there, it wasn't good. Jake had to make a call. Should they stick around and figure out what was happening or cut their losses and get home before something worse happened? The crew waited for his decision, each of them knowing that the wrong move could mean more than just losing crabs. It could mean losing more lives. The Wizard's captain, meanwhile, was furious. He knew his ship had barely escaped a collision, and his frustration boiled over as he shouted into the radio, questioning Jake's decisions. The two captains exchanged words, but the tension was clear. There was no room for error, not in these conditions, and definitely not when lives were on the line. The Bering Sea wasn't forgiving, and neither were the men who sailed it. The crew thought the worst was over, but another storm was already coming, one that would push their strength and courage to the edge. Back on the Wizard, the crew dealt with the aftermath of the near collision. The captain tried to calm his men down, explaining that they'd done the best they could under the circumstances. It was a close call, but they'd avoided a complete disaster, at least for now. But the real storm wasn't just outside. It was also in the minds of the crew, who now had to face the fact that their job was more dangerous than they ever wanted to admit. Every man there knew that the sea didn't play favorites. Today it was Jake's crew, tomorrow it could be theirs. The calm that followed didn't last long. Another wave hit, and this time it almost took Jacob, one of Jake's deckhands, overboard. He managed to grab onto the railing just in time, pulling himself back on deck, but it was too close. Jacob's face was pale, his hands shaking, but he forced a smile. That's what they did. They laughed off the fear because if you didn't, it would eat you alive. Captain Jake knew it too. He shouted an apology, but Jacob waved it off, though everyone could see just how shaken he really was. And then came the next challenge. Over on the summer bay, Captain Wild Bill faced his own crisis when a crew member went overboard. In the middle of hauling their pots, a man slipped, and before anyone could react, he was in the freezing water. The crew acted fast, pulling him back on board, but the damage was done. The shock of the icy water left the man shivering, barely able to stand. Bill knew that they couldn't stop, they had to keep working, but he also knew they'd dodged a bullet. The Bering Sea doesn't often give second chances. Captain Jake, Captain Wild Bill, Captain Keith, and Captain Harley, each of them had faced challenges that week that pushed them to their limits. They'd lost a man, nearly collided, battled the elements, and somehow kept going. It wasn't about the crabs anymore, it was about survival. The Bering Sea is a cruel place, and the men who fish its waters know that better than anyone. They go out there for the thrill, for the money, for the chance to prove themselves. But sometimes, the cost is too high. Captain Jake knew that, as did every other captain who'd been out there long enough. The sea doesn't give second chances, and when it does, you count yourself lucky and move on. They'd all seen enough to know that you take what the sea gives and you keep moving, because stopping means you're done. But the challenges weren't over yet. As the Cornelia Marie continued on, Captain Josh had to navigate through an area known for its unpredictable underwater currents. The sea below was a maze of currents that could pull the boat off course in seconds. The navigation instruments were working overtime, and the crew had to stay on high alert. The deckhands were exhausted, their muscles aching from the constant battle with the equipment and the sea. But there was no room for rest. Josh knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake, not in these waters. The waves grew bigger, crashing against the hull and sending icy spray across the deck. Captain Casey kept his eyes on the instruments, watching the depth gauge as they moved through the treacherous waters. One wrong move and they could end up grounded on an unseen reef, or worse, flipped by an underwater current they hadn't anticipated. The tension on the deck was palpable, every man knowing that their fate rested on the captain's decisions and the reliability of their instruments. Suddenly, the boat lurched to one side, and Josh grabbed the wheel, fighting to keep them steady. A powerful current had caught them, pulling the boat dangerously off course. The crew scrambled to adjust, their hearts pounding as the deck tilted under their feet. Casey shouted orders, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind and waves. They had to counter the current, fight against the pull, or risk being dragged into even more dangerous waters. The crew moved like a well-oiled machine, each man knowing his role and executing it with precision. They adjusted the lines, balanced the pots, and worked to steady the ship. It was moments like these that defined a crew, how they reacted when everything seemed to be going wrong. And somehow, they managed it. The boat slowly righted itself, the instrument stabilizing, and Josh let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had made it through, but the relief was short-lived. The sea didn't give them time to celebrate. Back on the Wizard, Captain Keith was facing his own nightmare. The storm had picked up again, and visibility was almost zero. The rain lashed against the windows of the wheelhouse, and the waves rose higher with each passing minute. Keith knew they had to keep moving, but the conditions were worsening. He had received another distress call, this time from a smaller boat caught in the storm. The Coast Guard was already stretched thin, and Keith knew that if they didn't intervene, those men might not make it. He made a quick decision. They would go after the distressed boat, despite the risks. He called down to his crew, informing them of the situation. The men on deck were already soaked to the bone, their bodies bruised and battered from the relentless waves. But when Keith's voice crackled over the radio, there was no hesitation. They nodded to each other, bracing for what was to come. They had been through storms before, and they knew what it took to survive. Now, it was about saving others. The wizard turned straight into danger, showing that staying brave and alive can mean risking everything when lives are at stake. Fighting waves to save a sinking ship. The wizard turned into the storm, the bow slicing through the waves as Keith pushed the throttle forward. The deckhands moved quickly, securing anything that could come loose, preparing the deck for the worst. The wind howled, the kind of sound that made it feel like the whole world was screaming. Keith kept his eyes on the radar, looking for any sign of the other boat. They had to be close, but in these conditions, close could mean a lot of things. Then, through the mist and rain, they saw it, a small fishing boat, barely holding on. It was being tossed around like a toy, the waves crashing over it, and Keith knew they didn't have much time. He maneuvered the wizard as close as he could, shouting into the radio for the other crew to get ready. It was a dangerous move, bringing two boats together in a storm like this. One wrong move and they could collide, causing more harm than good. The deckhands on the wizard threw lines over, trying to secure the smaller boat. It was a chaotic scene, the ropes whipping through the air, the men struggling to keep their footing on the slippery deck. But they managed it. Slowly, they pulled the smaller boat closer, the crew climbing aboard the wizard, each of them exhausted but alive. Keith watched as the last man made it across, a sense of relief washing over him. They had done it. They had saved them. But the storm wasn't over, and now they had even more lives depending on them. As the wizard fought its way back through the storm, Keith couldn't help but think about the risks they had taken. The Bering Sea was a place where mistakes cost lives, and they had been lucky. But luck wasn't something you could count on. He looked at the men huddled on deck, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. They had come close, too close. And he knew that the next time, they might not be so fortunate. On the summer bay, Captain Wild Bill was dealing with his own crisis. The storm had reached them, and the deck was a dangerous place to be. The waves crashed over the side, the icy water flooding the deck and making every step a risk. Bill knew they had to keep going, but the conditions were brutal. The men were exhausted, their bodies pushed to the limit, and Bill could see the fear in their eyes. They had already pulled one man out of the water that day, and the last thing they needed was another accident. But the sea didn't care about what they needed. As they worked to haul in the last of their pots, another wave hit, this one larger than the rest. It swept across the deck, knocking one of the men off his feet. He slid across the deck, his hands scrambling for something to hold onto. Bill watched from the wheelhouse, his heart in his throat. The man managed to grab onto a railing, pulling himself back up, but it was too close. Bill knew they had to get out of there. The crabs weren't worth losing another man. He called down to the deck, telling the crew to secure everything and get ready to head back to port. The men moved quickly, their relief evident. They had been pushing their luck, and they all knew it. As they turned the boat towards home, Bill couldn't help but feel a sense of failure. They had come out here to do a job, and they had done it, but at what cost? The sea had taken its toll, and Bill knew that they had been lucky to make it out with their lives. Back on the Cornelia Marie, Captain Josh was still battling the storm. The waves were relentless, the wind howling, and the deck was a dangerous place to be. The crew worked tirelessly, their bodies aching, their hands numb from the cold. They had been through storms before, but this one was different. It was like the sea was trying to break them, to see how much they could take before they gave in. As they worked to haul in the last of their pots, Josh couldn't help but think about the men he had lost over the years. The sea was a cruel mistress, and she didn't care about the lives she took. She didn't care about the families waiting at home or the dreams of the men who sailed her waters. She took what she wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The storm finally began to ease, the waves slowly subsiding, the wind dying down. The men of Summer Bay, Cornelia Marie, the Wizard, and all the other boats out on the Bering Sea had faced one of the toughest weeks of their lives. They had lost a man, saved another, and come close to losing it all. They had battled the elements, fought against the sea, and somehow they had made it through. Was this accident a tragic consequence of nature's fury, or could more have been done to prevent it? Tell us your thoughts and remember to like and subscribe for more.